So here's a fun experiment or exercise that we can all do, and you don't even need to leave your house. And it's really mind-blowing when you just focus and break it down. It comes from the early American naturalist and Church of Christ minister William J. Long in the year 1919. And here's the activity. Just go outside and scatter birdseed. Go to your yard or your balcony or a nearby park and just scatter some birdseed from the pet store or grocery store and watch what happens. You'll first see the usual neighborhood sparrows or finches come in, but just keep observing and waiting. Larger birds will arrive. And that makes sense because the larger birds would be attracted to the smaller birds. But then, most amazing of all, when you really think about it, is more exotic birds will appear. Over time, the birds you don't recognize, and again, you need to really pay attention, will start to appear. Types and species of birds that you rarely see in your neighborhood will overtake the birds that you usually take for granted in your commute. And it's all because of this little birdseed pile. The neighborhood common type moved to a larger type, and that makes sense. But then the birds from a distance arrive. And you need to ask yourself, how is this message being sent? You as the observer of this simple experiment get to enjoy the unique view of far more different species of different birds than what you usually get to see in your day-to-day commuting. But really think about it. What is this communication they're using? Or miraculously put, what is the communication that leads to this unique moment? How did we get here? And that's what leads me to this rather inelegant but still accurate metaphor that I'll return to throughout my talk. I'll use it mainly to describe and suggest the concept of evolution that is completely present in all things at all times. This is essentially the tree of life, all creatures starting from a similar source and branching off. I tried to find diagrams of tree of life, but none were complex enough for me. So we're using this metaphor with all these branches that we couldn't count unless we really wanted to spend our time here. We exist somewhere up here, or maybe here, on a far branch. And something like a sea cucumber exists over here on this far branch. A coral is maybe here, an alligator here, and a bat here. You and everything else on this planet is no more evolved or less evolved than anything else. What we recognize in a coral or an insect or a minute jellyfish only able to be seen under a microscope is not our ancestors, but relatives of early forms of an animal action. We all can recognize that life comes from the ocean, the classic image of a brave tree or fish climbing onto the surface of the earth. Our cells need to exist in fluid. That's why our bodies are 70% water. And whenever you swim into the ocean, you are not swimming into the past. The sponge, ascidian, and corals are all present-day animals, product of the same span of evolutionary time that produced humans. You are not among ancestors, you're among cousins, distant living kin. When you swim to somewhere like the Great Barrier Reef, the garden around you and you yourself exist on the top outermost branches. But think about the trunk or the branches that end early. Did life on Earth arrive just once or several times? Ernst Haeckel, the 19th century German zoologist and illustrator, believed that the spontaneous generation of life came from inanimate matter and was possible and perhaps even a common occurrence. He proposed that a substance known as bathybiate, a form of slime found deep on the ocean floor, was a fundamental type of life that bridged the gap between the inorganic and the organic. Ernst Haeckel believed ideas challenged the traditional view of life, which recognized only two types of living things, animals and plants. In the 18th century, the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus proposed a new system of classification that included a third realm of the inanimate or mineral kingdom. This three-way distinction is still used today in expressions like animal, vegetable, or mineral. If we know that evolution leads to complexity, we can peer inside of single cells and be surprised by the lack of organization. A single cell's parts seem indistinct without clear differentiation, and yet these cells are capable of carrying out complex functions. These observations lead some scientists to conclude that living activity could not be explained solely by the complex organization of matter. There must be something more, something that is inherently alive and could not be reduced to mere organization. As the philosopher Thomas Huxley put it, organization is the result of life, not life the result of organization. Physiologist William Benjamin Carpenter was amazed at what a single-cell organism could do. Quote, laying hold of its food without any members, swallowing without a mouth, digesting without a stomach, and moving from place to place without any discernible muscles. The philosophy of panpsychism, which I get into more in my first talk on plant consciousness, is the idea that consciousness precedes matter, and that just because we can't understand or recognize the conscious that's present in all matter doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Because as it stands now with science, there's no defining line of when consciousness begins. Panpsychism agrees with the way the world appears, but suggests that the material that makes up the world has a side that is faintly like a mind. The mind-like side of matter gives rise to experience and consciousness once some of that matter is organized into a brain. For some, mind is everywhere, while for others it is limited to human and the animals similar to us. Some people believe that paramecium have feelings, as they are responsive and have goals. But others dismiss even more complex animals like fish and say there is no feeling there at all, just reflexes and instincts. If either person is wrong, why are they wrong? If panpsychism is wrong and there is no hint of feeling in a grain of sand, why is that wrong? There is an arbitrariness to what people believe. Most people say that mammals and birds have experiences, and perhaps fish, amphibians, and reptiles. But pushing further out to ants, plants, and paramecium, and pulling further into animals only, the discussion becomes a complete mess. It's hard to work out who is right. Author Joseph Levine calls this the explanatory gap. If mind equals consciousness, we have to ask why this physical setup gives rise to this experience and not to something else. Cells are like bustling cities with a constant flow of traffic between the living systems and their surroundings. This traffic includes the flow of ions, the intake of raw materials, and the elimination of waste. While cells are bounded, they are not closed systems. There is a permeable character to cellular life, and that's why I describe this traffic of in and out. The traffic has a metabolic side where cells get and use energy to stay alive, and an informational side where incoming influences are important for what they predict or indicate. When we think of animals, we usually think of mammals like dogs or cats, but animals extend much further. The metazoa, which is probably, let's say it's this part, the metazoa, which form a large branch of the tree, includes corals, wasps, and multi-ton whales. Animals are not arranged in a hierarchy from lower to higher, and insects are no lower than humans. Everything alive now is in these outermost limbs on the tree of life. Sponges, comb jellies, and placozoas are genetically very far from us. Cephalopods, octopuses are a little closer to us, but these are all relatives, and they've all been evolving over time the same as us. Looking at our distant relatives gives us clues about what our ancestors might have been like. But these relatives distant on the tree of life are not those ancestors. Corals are cnidarians, which includes jellyfish and anemones. This group diverged from us at a time early in animal life, probably like right here on the tree of life. A coral might share an ancestor with us from 700 million years ago. Cnidarians have a radial body and are organized around a disc or cup fringed with tentacles. They have a complicated life cycle and multiple bodily forms with two adult forms, the polyp and the medusa. Think of a barnacle and a jellyfish. These were the earliest styles of radial life. The first sensing the first animal ever did was most likely a sense of gravity. The cnidarians have a sense of balance that they use to orient themselves. With cnidarians and this first sensing, we have the origin of feelings in the most literal sense. And at this point, we begin to talk about subjectivity and agency. Subjectivity is all about how things seem to a person. It's the experience happening to you, your subjective reality. On the other hand, agency is all about what you do and what you make happen. It's being the source of an action and its effects. The word subject has connotations of being a doer or an initiator, as opposed to an object. So subjectivity and agency point to different aspects of an animal, the first sensory and active side. Subjectivity and agency are always connected, evolutionarily speaking. Sensing is necessary for controlling an action because there is no biological gain in taking in information that you're not going to use. So the evolution of the mind includes the connected evolution of agency and subjectivity. But that doesn't mean they always develop in that order. Sometimes there might be a breakthrough in the realm of action, and a new kind of agency comes into being along with simple sensory capabilities. Fred Kaiser, a senior professor of biology at MIT, emphasized the shaping of action as a central concern in the evolution of our nervous system. In the early days, animals had to rely on complex motion to survive, and in doing so, they developed new kinds of sensing as a consequence. Even an entire inward-facing system like our nervous system would still be responsive to things on the outside, because an expansion of action carries an expansion of sensitivity along with it. All living beings, by definition, do things, of course. They adjust their activities in effect to what's around them. But in animals, the metazoa kingdom, this takes on a new form of multicellular action, produced by developing sheets of cells, contracting, twisting, and grasping. These are nerves and muscles that come into being, and with them, complex actions of sensing. And in a period of Earth's history, 635 million years ago, known as the Ediacaran, we see the first fossil evidence of this kind of action, and it changed everything. I should say the fossil evidence we find in the Ediacaran is not the start of life, it's just the fossil evidence we're able to find, because the start of life was most likely jellies, which don't usually leave fossils. In the Ediacaran, soft-bodied, frond, fern-like creatures lived on a shallow seafloor with limited movement due to the low oxygen levels. The sea surface was a tangled mess of living and dead creatures, mostly two-dimensional, with some grazing on a mat of algae and bacteria. One such creature, the Dickinsonia, moved around like a flattened earthworm, its movements aimed at a target, and Dickinsonia literally looks like a flattened earthworm, no eyes, but it was one of the first creatures that was able to move. Dickinsonia was also one of the first creatures to be bilateral. Most of what you encounter in your life is bilateral. You have 2 arms and 2 legs on either side, 2 eyes, a cockroach, a llama. Most of the creatures in the world are bilateral, but they didn't start that way. Dickinsonia, or one of its ancestors, was the first bilateral creature, and we have no fossil evidence of the first bilateral creature. Plenty of things predated Dickinsonia. The emergence of a bilateral symmetry had significant downstream consequences. Something like Dickinsonia was probably the last common ancestor for you and a butterfly, or you and an octopus. You put them here somewhere. So we've got the polyps, and then as soon as Dickinsonia starts moving around, we go here and the humans go off here. I mentioned Dickinsonia because it was one of the first organisms to move, to actively pursue its prey. And here we come to a place where we can work out a sense of what it means to be an animal, distinctive from other kinds of life. This way of being came about by the formation of the animal body and its actions. Imagine a small organism that would benefit in an evolutionary sense from getting bigger. There are 2 ways to do this. Retain your shape and build on it at a larger scale. That's what most animals do. Rats lead to cows. Another approach is to just repeat the small form you have and then repeat it again. This is a modular body plan. This creates a tight-knit colony of repeated units. This is seen in cells that divide and corals, and to a large extent in plants. Looking at modular organisms, it's hard to tell what counts as a single individual. Is it the branches of the coral or the small polyps that make it up? The small units have a degree of autonomy. They reproduce individually, for example, while still dependent on the larger unit to stay alive. Modular organisms produce branching tree-like forms, such as an ant colony. The road to animal life begins with single-celled eukaryotes, leading to the integration of countless cells and a new kind of living unit. Through the origins of nervous systems and muscle action is created a multicellular scale. The bilateral animals arise, then there's a series of branchings. All this occurred before the Cambrian, and most of it predates the fossil record. New modes of living in the Cambrian appeared, pioneered by the arthropods, relatives of modern shrimps and insects. Actions that were scaffolded by standardized bodies and jointed limbs. When the Dickinsonia flatworm and the first arthropods, a deep fork stems in our tree of life. Up until this time, our history was shared with the history of ants and crabs and octopus. After this, the lines diverge independently. What evolution has brought forth is not just new organisms, larger and more complicated than earlier ones, but a new kind of being and a new sense of self. These are organisms tied together in new ways and have new engagements with their environments. With these innovations of body plans working together, we have beings that respond to the environment as a realm beyond, sensing and acting with a sense of self, subjectivity, and agency. For a person sensing what goes on around them and acting, subjectivity involves feelings. Agency is the doing and initiating. All living things composed of cells exhibit something like subjectivity and agency, but these features take a different form in animals. Philosophical debates of mind and body see subjectivity as the main problem. Subjective experience is one label for something that is hard to explain. Agency is easier to understand, but the sensing and feeling side of life is entangled with action. These are two subparts of a person, almost two people, but the roles are not so separate. You are not two people faced back to back, but subject and agent together. As evolution proceeded, animals became a new type of intersection point in the world's network of causal pathways. When an animal senses information of various kinds, it becomes a point at which lines converge. When it is an initiator of an action, it becomes a point from which causal lines diverge, spreading downstream and often looping back to affect the animal's senses. An animal is also a place where the present intersects the past. Your handling of the present is affected by what you have seen before and how well previous actions seem to have been turned out. Incoming information about the here and now interacts with times past. These features and this placement in the world are common, but not inevitable products of the animal way of life. Animals of this kind have a point of view, and from that viewpoint comes action. Some of what falls under subjective experience is an expected, comprehensible consequence of animal evolution. The evolution of animal agency brings with it the origin of a subject. Sensing is an important part of experience, but it's not all that goes on with experience. If feelings are sensory, what about the feelings that come from inside us? We use sensing to cover internal goings-on, such as hunger or fever. We have both inward-pointing and outward-pointing sensors. The philosopher Jesse Prince argues that all consciousness is perceptual, while, as the author Fred Desky says, the clearest and most compelling case of consciousness are found in sensory experiences and the belief. The clearest and most compelling cases of consciousness are sensory experience and belief. Surely equal clear and compelling are emotions, moods, and urges. I say those are quite a bit more clear as cases of consciousness than experience and belief. Perhaps emotions and modes are perceptions of hormonal activities or the states of our cellular makeup. As an experiment, treat all kinds of experience as sensing or tracking or registering something. The experience of a bad mood is your detection of something going on inside you. Alternatively, it is the idea that an emotion or mood is not present of some fact or condition. It is just the way things are with you in that moment. Consider energy level or fatigue. Let's make it more abstract and consider mental fatigue, being overworked. The heaviness and dullness that sets in feels like something. It is an experience. Doesn't it make sense that this is a presentation of you and the state of your body? A fuel gauge showing a low reading? The alternative is your experience just includes or is saturated by this foggy, heavy feeling for no reason. There's a difference you can feel between thought processes being slow or agile and easy. Energy level is an aspect of your activity, one that is felt. Surges of resolve are another example that moves away from experience just being detection and perception. They push towards experience being an aspect of living activity as a whole. Experience is not a matter of being told. Most of your life is felt. A thought experiment by the author John Soule examines this as follows. Imagine that you wake from a dreamless sleep in a completely dark room. You have no coherent stream of thought or perceptual stimulus other than your pressure of the body on the bed. You are receiving no outside sensory stimulus. All the same, there's a difference in the state of your brain in this current situation of minimal wakefulness and the state of unconsciousness you were in before when you were asleep. This state of wakefulness without any sensory input is what we refer to as background consciousness. Where did this background consciousness start? Well, mammals are an offshoot of the fish part of the tree of life. We are descended from fish in a way that does not apply to the arthropods, shrimps, insects, or cephalopods, octopus. Our distant ancestors were a type of fish that doesn't have any relation to insect or jellyfish. Biologist Neil Shubin likes to remind us of this with his book, Your Inner Fish, as fish anatomy is still a big influence on our own bodies. It's not like we have an inner hermit crab or an inner octopus. The closest fish relatives are the lobe fishes, which look like the deep sea coelacanths, heavily armored fish. These early forms were the first to have a nerve cord running down the center of their bodies, organizing muscle and beginning of hard internal parts. They were actually the likely prey of the arthropods when they evolved predation in the Cambrian period. So it makes sense that fish were the first animals to develop great eyesight. Their singular eyes on each side of their bodies were way more effective than the cluster of sensors on the top of the heads that arthropods had. But the biggest breakthrough for fish that had the greatest influence downstream came about 420 million years ago, when fish's gill flaps evolved into the very first jaw. This tinkering, as French biologist Francois Jacob calls it, allowed them to have a muscular, unified bite. In short, it was an opposable thumb for your face. Well, that didn't get a laugh. Opposable thumb for your face? That's a big deal. With their new eyes and new jaws, by about 360 million years ago, jawless animals were fading away and jaws were diversifying. The lateral line system of the fish begins to take shape. A distinctive evolutionary advantage. This lateral line system is a tactile sense or form of touch. The main elements of a lateral line system are a small collection of cells with protruding hairs, each inside of a small soft cup. These units spread in many places over the body and are called neuromasts. They are sensitive to the movement of water and make contact with the nerves beneath them. Some are on the outside, while others are in thin, fluid-filled canals just below the body's surface. The canals run mainly front to back and are open via pores to the water outside. The neuromasts inside these canals are sensitive to differences in pressure and tiny vibrations. Water currents on the body creates pressure difference as it interacts through these pores. This system is a form of touch connected to the vast liquid field of the ocean. The motions and pressures of this form of touch evolved into our perception of sound. Hearing is the detection of pressure waves that move parts of your body. Thus, this movement runs from the eardrum to the cochlear hairs in your inner ear. In fish, this lateral line system mixes touch with hearing. Hairs protruding from cells are a very old idea. Flagellum are present in the most common single-celled ancestors. Those hairs propelled the body, had an active role. and were sensing, registering touch and motion in the surrounding liquid medium around them. In animals, the first gravity sensing organs of jellyfish discussed earlier worked in the same way. Hairs detecting the motion of crystals as the body tilts. For vertebrates, the lateral line canals were precursors to ears like us. The lateral line system has been described as touch at a distance, detecting movement close by and further away. As it encompasses so much of the fish, it must give rise to strong bodily awareness, a touch-like contact with much of a fish's environment. It is not an exaggeration to say that a fish body is a giant pressure-sensitive ear. In the most basic way, all of our senses are just one sense, a sense of touch or pressure. Remember that cells make up life and are surrounded by a semi-permeable membrane that controls the flow of traffic in or out. The traffic of ions on a cellular level expands to tactile sense, but also to sight, to smell. We don't smell, the cells in our body decide to let certain things in and let certain things out so that we perceive smell. The accepting or rejecting of information is inherently pressure and expands out to all of life's functions. William J. Long, the earlier naturalist and preacher who gave us the birdseed experiment at the start of his talk, introduced the English-speaking world to the concept of chumpo. Chumpo comes from the Bantu people of the Lake Meru region of Zambia. The Bantu see chumpo, their word for lake, not as a sixth sense, but as an amalgam of all forms of sensing, the five senses we are aware of and far beyond. And the concept of cellular traffic supports this, and the idea of cellular traffic supports this concept. In the 1920s, Hans Berger was passionate about understanding the hidden connections between mind and matter. He believed in telepathy and ESP and used a galvanometer to measure the electrical activity of the brain, sometimes even placing it directly on the brains of people with injuries. Through his research, he discovered that the brain produces regular waves of electrical activity, which can be detected a short distance away from it. Two types of waves are most noticeable: alpha waves, which were slower and more far-reaching, and observed when a subject had their eyes closed, and beta waves, which were quicker and shallower when the eyes were open. These discoveries led to the first ever recordings of EEGs in humans. It's not quite telepathy, but it's something that's still pretty strange. Ions are charged atoms that play a part in the activity across cell membranes, which includes nerve cells that undergo action potentials. The transmission of influence from one neuron to another is accomplished through the release of chemicals across a space between them. The brain's electrical activity creates a network of these events that generate a field around it. The reason we can listen into these rhythms is due to the fact that those local electric events generate this field. These fields generate rhythmic patterns that are different from the local signal between cells. These patterns are found in many animals and suggest a coordinated transmission. While it could be a meaningless byproduct, much has to happen for a rhythm to exist. What if the fields themselves have a biological role? What Hans Berger recorded on the EEG was part of the brain's operations, not just a byproduct. In 1942, French neurophysiologist Angelique Arventaki was studying the nervous system of mollusks. She was trying to understand the synapse, the gaps between two neurons in a network. Arventaki was trying to understand how the gap was bridged and discovered that nerve cells could influence each other without the influence going through the nerve cells at all. Today, this is known as emphatic coupling of nerve cells. In some cases, the rhythmic patterns and fields generated by a whole region of the brain affect the activity of individual cells. In particular, the timing of the activity of neurons and their spikes is affected by these fields, and this appears to be the way that brains synchronize the actions in their cells. These influences have been shown to travel between pieces of brains that have been surgically separated but are near to each other. This is present in animals, with the often overlooked but ubiquitous mysterious transference of an impulse over wide distances. A strange anecdote I came across while doing research for this came from a Nantucket whaler in the early 1900s and goes as follows. There's the queerest habit of a whale or any other critter I ever fell foul of, and it was this. When I got my boat close enough to a sperm whale and put an iron in him, every other sperm whale within 10 miles would turn their flukes as if they had been harpooned too. This is not the most convincing case for telepathy with animals that we can observe. The most convincing case comes between dogs and their owners. A special connection that often involves anticipation of the owner's arrival. Merlin Sheldrake wrote Dogs to Anticipate Their Owners about 20 years ago, and a lot of this research comes from the things that he was able to, the research he was able to do. For example, Teresa Preston's dog Jackson would wait for her children's arrival from school, but also seemed to know when her husband, a US Coast Guard captain stationed 20 miles away, was coming home. Jackson would station himself at the end of the sidewalk and look in the direction he knew the car would travel. This behavior was not explainable by any routine. He did not keep a set schedule. You could explain it as a sense of smell, but dogs with the strongest sense of smell, such as a bloodhound, cannot track scents from more than half a mile away, and that's only when you're downwind. Dogs' anticipation of their owner's arrival often happens several miles away and cannot be reasonably explained by scent alone. Imagine saying that something senses the owner coming home when the owner is in a sealed off steel cage with smoke blowing behind it, surrounded by a bunch of other steel cages with smoke blowing. It doesn't make any sense. Additionally, dogs' hearing is often thought to be much better than humans, but new evidence suggests that dogs' sensitivity to noise levels is similar to that of humans. They can just hear a higher range, while not the lower ranges that we can hear. However, dogs do seem to react to an owner's intention to come home, with dogs waiting at the door when their owner begins a walk towards their car. From Sheldrake's book, Monika Suhr of Munich, Germany, carried out a series of tests with her dog Pluto, whose reactions were observed by her partner at home. Pluto not only reacted when Monika set off to come home in her car, but also when she set off in a friend's car, with which Pluto would have been unfamiliar. When she returned home by taxi, Pluto reacted 40 minutes before her arrival. The journey took 30 minutes, but Monika telephoned for the taxi and waited an additional 10 minutes before setting off. The dog reacted not to Monika getting in the taxi, but when she ordered it. There's evidence in Sheldrake's books of dogs reacting to their owners looking at their watch and expressing an interest in wanting to return home. This ability is also present in cats, but has been recorded in about 30% of felines as opposed to the 50 to 60% in dogs. Our own Nico Price has reported evidence of her dog, or her cat, Carl, waiting by the door, by the window when she's about to get off work. She has a camera in her house, and it's not logically possible for Carl to be able to anticipate her return without some sort of connection to mind. Interestingly, it'll make sense for cat owners. Cats also anticipate the arrival of people with whom they have a strong aversion. Mosette Broderick of Manhattan became the object of a cat's aversion by helping her former professor, who told her that his cat hated him for days after a trip to the vet. Mosette volunteered to take Kitty to the vet herself, so the kitty started hating her instead. Quote, as the years passed, this kitty developed her disgust towards me to such a degree that my professor always knew when I was on his block. When I would turn down 62nd Street from Lexington Avenue, 200 feet and a lot of noise away, the kitty would run and hide behind the stairs, which she only did when she expected my arrival. The curious fact here is that I would be out of hearing, sight, and smell range. In a crowded city like New York, she could not have heard me over the din of the traffic. She certainly could not have seen me. Smell in winter in New York with the door, her sense of smell in winter in New York with the door shut and the heat on in the house could also not have been a factor. I was also not always there at the same day or time, so schedule is not possible either. 50 to 60% of dogs show this behavior and 30% of cats. Cats may be capable of knowing when their owners are setting off for home, but they just might not have the motivation to respond in advance. Dogs are traditionally used to give warnings of people approaching, whereas cats are not expected to play this role. Cats disappear before visits to the vet. Dogs anticipate going for a walk. Fish schools can move at remarkable speed and coordination, turning and expanding in a fraction of a second. Individuals on the flank of the school will assume the lead position and vice versa. The school of fish will split in half to avoid a predator and then reconnect without any fish ever colliding. Their movements are so fast that it's impossible for nerve impulses to travel from the eye to the brain and then to the muscles. Instead, it's suggested that the fish are able to coordinate their movements through a kind of collective intelligence, or a field, like the brain field that we create, that that was discussed earlier, similar to how iron filings move around a magnetic field. Birds also exhibit this collective behavior. The naturalist Edward Solis observes starlings moving in unison as if they were one organism. Wayne Potts studied the banking movements of flocks of dunlins using a high-speed camera and found that their movements are initiated by a single individual within the flock and then propagated like a wave. But it's almost always a different individual within the flock. The reaction of dunlins to visual stimuli is far too slow to account for their behavior. I think it's 15 milliseconds that they react in the flock, and it's a 15th of a millisecond that they react in the flock, and then it's 38 milliseconds that they react to visual stimuli in tests. So the reactions that fish and birds are able to do is 1,000th of what we've been able to perceive from their normal sensory reaction times, sight, smell. This is all to say and suggest that this is a result of a field phenomenon. Sheldrake refers to this as the morphic field, and it's related to the electrical field that our brain produces. Just because we can't perceive it or use it doesn't mean that it's not existing and isn't a part of an animal's conscious decision-making. The story of mind and felt experience comes out of the story of animal life. Animal evolution produced a new kind of being with new kinds of engagement with the world through senses and action. It produced subjectivity and agency. It also produced animals who handle their dealings with the world in a way that includes a tacit sense of self. I don't think a sense of self is the solution to Robert Nagel's hard problem of consciousness. If you want to hear more about that, go to the plant talk. A turning on of the experiential lights, but it is important as a feature of the shape of acting and action in animals, and clearly relevant to subjectivity. What is special about a brain is the combination of cell-to-cell influences, organizing stimuli from sensory surfaces, creating coordinated action and large-scale activity patterns. All this was shaped by evolution. It's not something that nature just produces. It evolved to enable action and its control. The storms within cells threading together of activity, perturbed rhythms of their electrical breathing, and their large-scale coordination are the stuff of the mind. This is what we are asked to identify with. Not that our minds are a consequence of this, that our minds are such activities. And this is an imaginative leap. A unity in the world's basic composition despite the apparent differences between mind and matter. We are not extra additions to the physical world, but aspects of its inherent working. We are of these activities rather than tied to them. Thank you.